There comes a moment in life when everything changes. You've spent your life raising your children, making sacrifices and putting them first. But at some point, they start to treat you differently, ignoring your advice, disregarding your feelings, and making you feel like a burden. This change is hard to accept, but it's common for many parents. So, what can you do when your children no longer respect you? Today, I'll share powerful ways to regain that respect and restore the relationship. When does the change happen? For many parents, it's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when their relationship with their children shifts from loving respect to quiet disregard. At first, the signs are often subtle. It starts with small things. They stop asking for your opinion. They begin to talk down to you, or maybe they forget to call as often as they used to. It's almost like they don't need you as much anymore. Take Mr. King, for example. He's a 61-year-old father who had spent his entire life putting his children first. For years, he gave his best advice, supported their dreams, and made sacrifices without thinking twice. But one day he noticed something unsettling. His children had stopped calling regularly. At first it was just a missed call here and there. Then it became a week without a word. The thing that really stung was how they started dismissing his advice. "That's old-fashioned, Dad," one of them said, rolling their eyes. Another brushed off his thoughts as not relevant anymore. It hurt. He'd given them everything, and now they were brushing him aside like his opinions didn't matter. Mr. King didn't understand why this was happening. He had been a good father, a provider, a mentor, and a friend. Why were they treating him like this? The truth is, when respect starts to fade, it can feel like a punch to the gut. You've spent so many years building a relationship based on love and care, but suddenly the dynamic changes. The relationship doesn't feel as warm as it once did. It's a painful realization, and it can leave you feeling confused, hurt, and even angry. But here's the important thing. Recognizing the problem is the first step toward a solution. It's easy to fall into the trap of blaming yourself or getting upset, but understanding that the shift has occurred is crucial. The more you're able to identify these small signs, the sooner you can start addressing them and take steps to restore the respect you deserve. One of the biggest mistakes many parents make, especially as their children grow older, is trying too hard to win their approval. We all want to feel appreciated and loved by our children, but the truth is, constantly seeking their validation can actually harm the relationship. This is something Mr. King learned the hard way. For years, Mr. King had tried to be the perfect dad. He bent over backward to accommodate his children's needs, even when it meant sacrificing his own comfort. If they needed him to drop everything to help with a problem, he was there. If they wanted him to listen to their long rants about their frustrations, he was all ears. Even when his own plans or needs were on the line, he would push them aside to make sure his children were happy. He thought that by constantly pleasing them, he would earn their respect and admiration. But over time, something strange happened. The more he tried to please them, the less respect they had for him. At first, Mr. King didn't notice. After all, they were still calling him for advice and seeking his guidance, right? But soon enough, the respect began to fade. His children didn't value his time anymore. They expected him to be available whenever it suited them, and became annoyed when he set boundaries. They took him for granted because deep down, they knew he would always be there to please them. The painful truth is that respect doesn't come from constantly pleasing others. It comes from respecting yourself. If you act like your feelings don't matter, they will begin to believe it. When you make their needs your priority at the expense of your own, you send a message that your well-being and opinions aren't important. This is not how you earn respect. Instead, it teaches them that they can take you for granted because you're always willing to give in. It's time to stop chasing approval. Mr. King realized that the more he stopped trying to win his children's favor, the more they began to see him in a new light. Instead of always saying yes, he learned to say no when he needed to. He set boundaries and stuck to them, and slowly, his children began to treat him with the respect he deserved. The moment he started respecting his own time and opinions, they started to respect him more as well. So if you're finding yourself constantly trying to win your children's approval, it's time to take a step back. Focus on what makes you happy, set your own boundaries, and don't be afraid to speak your mind. Your children will notice the change, and more importantly, they will start to see you as a person who deserves respect, not just someone who exists to please them. Regaining your children's respect starts with something crucial: respecting yourself. It sounds simple, but it's often the hardest step for many parents. They spend years putting their children's needs first, often at the expense of their own. But here's the key: if you don't value yourself, it becomes nearly impossible to earn the respect of those around you, especially your children. Take Margaret's story. Margaret was a retired woman who had spent most of her life dedicating herself to her children. She was the type of person who always put them first. Whether it was rearranging her schedule to accommodate their needs, or holding back her own opinions just to keep the peace. She told herself that it was worth it, that this was just what a good mother did. But over time, she began to notice that her children were taking her for granted. They didn't ask for her opinion anymore, and when they did, they often dismissed it. They came to expect that she would always give in, always adjust her plans for them, and never rock the boat. The more Margaret sacrificed her own wants and needs, the less respect her children had for her. They saw her as someone who was always available, always willing to bend, and that made her less valuable in their eyes. The respect they had for her slowly disappeared, and they began to treat her more like a servant than a parent. But then Margaret realized something. She had been neglecting herself for so long that she had lost her sense of self-worth. She was no longer just a mother to her children. She was a person with her own needs, desires, and opinions. And if she wanted to regain their respect, she needed to start by respecting herself. Margaret took a bold step. She started setting boundaries. When her children asked her to rearrange her plans, she said, "No, I have plans of my own today." When they dismissed her opinions, she spoke up. She told them that she deserved to be heard. At first, it wasn't easy. Her children resisted, confused by her newfound confidence. But slowly, things began to change. As she started to stand firm in her decisions and assert her own voice, her children began to notice. They saw a woman who wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. And with that, their respect for her began to grow again. The truth is, your self-respect is contagious. When you stand firm in your beliefs and set clear boundaries, others will take notice. They will see that you value yourself, and that will make them value you more. It's like a ripple effect. When you respect yourself, others start to respect you too. So, if you're struggling to regain your children's respect, start by respecting yourself. Speak up for your needs. Set healthy boundaries, and never shy away from showing them the value you place on your own time and opinions. When you stand strong in your own self-worth, your children will start to see you as someone deserving of respect. When someone disrespects you, especially your own children, the natural reaction is often to argue. You feel the need to defend yourself to prove that you deserve respect. It's only human to want to stand your ground when your dignity is challenged. However, fighting for respect rarely yields the results you hope for. In fact, it can often push people further away, including your children. Take Frank's experience. Frank, a retired teacher, had always been a pillar of strength and authority in his family. But as his children grew older, he began to notice a shift. They started to disregard his advice and even dismiss his opinions. It hurt him deeply, and naturally he tried to argue his way back into their good graces. He raised his voice, pointing out how much he had sacrificed for them, reminding them of his role as their father. But the more he argued, the more his children withdrew. The arguments only seemed to reinforce the divide. They saw Frank as someone who needed validation, someone who was constantly trying to prove his worth, and in doing so, he unknowingly lost the very respect he was fighting to regain. It wasn't until Frank realized this pattern that he understood the mistake he was making. Arguing for respect wasn't helping, it was hurting the relationship. Instead of continuing to fight for respect, Frank decided to change his approach. He stopped engaging in heated arguments and started leading by example. He began to carry himself with more dignity and confidence. He didn't need to prove his worth with words. His actions spoke for themselves. Frank set boundaries without explanation, held his ground without getting defensive, and maintained his self-respect regardless of how his children treated him. Over time, his children started to notice the change. They saw a man who wasn't desperate for their approval but who commanded respect simply by the way he conducted himself. And slowly, their attitude towards him shifted. They began to value his opinions once again and treated him with the respect he had long deserved. The lesson here is clear. Arguing for respect rarely works. Instead of fighting for it, focus on being the person who commands respect through actions, not words. When you stop arguing and start carrying yourself with dignity, others will take notice. Respect isn't something that can be demanded. It's something that is earned through how you live your life and how you treat yourself. In the heat of the moment, it can be incredibly difficult to resist the urge to argue when your children dismiss your opinions or challenge your authority. But getting caught in the trap of constant arguments only leads to frustration and distance. The key to regaining respect is not to fight for it. It's to embody wisdom and strength in your responses or lack thereof. Take Frank's journey as an example. As his children grew older, they became more independent and less inclined to listen to his advice. At first, he reacted with frustration, trying to convince them that he knew better. But soon he realized that this approach wasn't working. The more he argued, the further his children pulled away. They were no longer listening. They were just waiting for their turn to speak. Frank decided to try something different. Instead of arguing when his children dismissed his ideas, he remained calm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't try to force his perspective on them. He simply listened. He listened to their opinions, to their reasoning, and to their thoughts without judgment. And instead of jumping in with a counter-argument, he took a moment to respond thoughtfully. Or sometimes, he didn't respond at all. By doing this, Frank showed his children a new way of interacting, one where calmness and understanding replaced defensiveness and hostility. He showed them that it's not always necessary to argue in order to be heard. In silence, he demonstrated that he had the wisdom to choose when to speak and when to listen, and that this was an even stronger form of strength than fighting. The real shift came when his children started to see that Frank didn't need to fight for respect anymore. He wasn't begging for validation or approval. He was steady, calm, and sure of himself. This quiet strength sent a powerful message. Frank didn't need to argue to prove his point. His demeanor alone conveyed his wisdom, his confidence, and his self-respect. When you listen more and argue less, you model a kind of strength that doesn't rely on force or confrontation. You show your children that they don't have to fight to be heard, and that true respect comes from understanding and mutual listening. In doing so, you send the message that you don't need to fight for respect, because you already have it, and that speaks volumes. As you grow older, one of the hardest lessons to learn is that you can't depend on your children for emotional fulfillment. It's natural to want their attention, their calls, and their presence in your life. But making them the center of your emotional world can lead to disappointment, frustration, and even resentment. Helen, a devoted mother, had spent decades prioritizing her children above everything else. She had sacrificed her own dreams, time, and energy to ensure they had the best life possible. But as they grew older and built lives of their own, she started feeling an emptiness she couldn't ignore. The phone calls became less frequent, the visits rare. Helen found herself waiting for them to reach out, constantly feeling hurt when they didn't. At first, she tried reminding them, subtly at first, then more directly. She would say things like, "You never call me anymore," hoping they would understand her loneliness. But instead of drawing them closer, her neediness seemed to push them further away. They became even less responsive, and she felt more isolated than ever. One day, Helen made a decision. Instead of waiting for her children to give her the love and attention she craved, she started focusing on herself. She picked up old hobbies she had abandoned years ago, reconnected with old friends, and even joined a local book club. She traveled, learned new things, and filled her days with activities that brought her joy. Something interesting happened. As Helen became more independent, her children started to notice. They began calling more often, asking about her life, and even making plans to visit. Without realizing it, Helen had changed the dynamic. Instead of chasing their attention, she created a life so fulfilling that they wanted to be part of it. The key takeaway? The less you depend on them for emotional validation, the more they will respect and value you. When you stop making them responsible for your happiness, they naturally become more drawn to you. Emotional independence isn't about shutting them out. It's about building a life where their presence is a bonus, not a necessity. And in doing so, you create stronger, healthier relationships built on mutual respect rather than silent expectations. And setting boundaries. Why it's crucial. Respect starts with boundaries. If you don't set them, people, yes, even your own children, will treat you however they please. Many parents let things slide, thinking it's just a phase or that speaking up will create tension. But the truth is, without clear boundaries, disrespect only grows. Robert, a retired businessman, was no stranger to this. His children often interrupted him mid-sentence, dismissed his advice, and made decisions without considering his feelings. At first he ignored it, hoping they would eventually realize their behavior was hurtful. But as time passed, their disrespect only became more frequent. One day, after being cut off in the middle of a conversation for the 100th time, Robert had enough. He calmly but firmly said, "You can disagree with me, but you will respect me." His children were taken aback. He had never spoken up like that before. From that moment on, the tone of their conversations changed. They started listening more, pausing before interrupting, and treating him with the respect he had always deserved. The lesson? Setting boundaries might feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you've spent years letting things slide. But it's a necessary step if you want to be treated with dignity. Boundaries aren't about being harsh or distant. They're about teaching others how to treat you. When you set clear expectations, you command respect without having to fight for it. Setting boundaries is only the first step. Enforcing them is where real change happens. Many parents express their limits but back down when their children push back. This inconsistency sends the message that boundaries are negotiable, which leads to further disrespect. Robert learned this the hard way. After finally standing up for himself and demanding respect, his children didn't immediately change. At first, they tested him, ignoring his requests and continuing old habits. But this time, Robert refused to let it slide. If they interrupted him, he calmly stopped, talking until they were ready to listen. When they dismissed his opinions, he made it clear that he wouldn't engage in one-sided conversations. At first, his children were frustrated. They were used to getting their way. But as Robert remained firm, without anger or argument, they slowly adjusted. They began listening more, speaking with more care, and treating him with the respect he had long deserved. The key takeaway? Boundaries only work if you enforce them. It's not about being controlling or distant, it's about showing that you value yourself enough to expect respect. When your children see that you won't tolerate being treated poorly, they'll start to change their behavior. Stand firm. Speak up when necessary. Respect yourself first, and others will follow. Regaining respect from your children is not something that happens overnight. It took Mr. King a while to realize that quick fixes wouldn't work. At first, he felt discouraged when his efforts didn't bring immediate results. But instead of giving up, he focused on making small, steady changes, setting clear boundaries, leading by example, and becoming emotionally independent. At first, his children didn't seem to notice, but as time passed, they started seeing him differently. They saw a father who valued himself, who wasn't desperate for approval, and who carried himself with quiet strength. Slowly but surely, their attitude toward him changed. If you want to regain respect, be patient. Big changes don't happen all at once, but every small step you take, standing firm, staying calm, and putting yourself first, will add up. Over time, your children will come to appreciate and respect you again. The key to regaining respect is not about demanding it or trying to control how others see you. True respect comes from within. It's about how you carry yourself, how you set boundaries, and how you value your own worth. If you walk through life with confidence, treat yourself with dignity, and refuse to let others take advantage of you, people, including your children, will notice. They will see a person who stands firm in their beliefs, who doesn't beg for approval, and who knows their own value. At first, it may feel difficult. You might doubt yourself or feel the urge to go back to old habits, but stay consistent. Keep reinforcing your boundaries. Stop seeking validation from others and instead, focus on living a fulfilling life on your own terms. Over time, your children will begin to see you differently, and your relationship with them will grow stronger. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And the best way to earn it is by showing the world that you already respect yourself. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You're well on your way to regaining the respect that you deserve from your children. It's important to understand that respect can't be demanded, nor can it be forced. Rather, it's something that naturally grows from the way you live your life, how you carry yourself, and how you treat yourself and others. The journey to regaining that respect starts with small but powerful actions, setting clear boundaries, respecting your own needs and emotions, and not seeking validation or approval from those around you. By making these changes, you show your children not just your worth, but also the strength and self-respect that will naturally command their attention and admiration. It won't happen overnight, but with time, patience, and consistency, the seeds you plant today will lead to the growth of a stronger, more respectful relationship in the future. So, take action today. Start setting boundaries. Start respecting yourself. And most importantly, stop chasing approval. Trust that your children will begin to notice the difference and respect you once again. If these tips resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more content that helps you grow and strengthen your relationships. You've got this. Keep pushing forward and remember that change takes time, but the results are always worth the effort.